Hi, welcome back. About a week ago, I posted on the Tesla SolarCity deal and specifically on the fairness opinions contained in the prospectus filed for that deal. I took issue with what Lazard and Evercore did in those valuations and characterized them as either lazy or incompetent or both. Not surprisingly, a post like that is going to get its own reactions, and this one did. Though surprisingly few from bankers and a surprisingly large number from lawyers and journalists, which tells you a little bit about the fairness opinion. In summary, here's what they pointed out. In fact, I will use one article in Bloomberg from a writer that I respect, Matt Levine, where here's what he said about my post. He said, hey, you know what? You're missing the point here. He said, a fairness opinion is not a real valuation. It's not a pure effort to estimate the value of a company from first principles and independent research. I think he was missing my point. I wasn't looking for pure effort or first principles. I was willing to accept impure and biased efforts with third principles, and this did not meet that standard. But there is this point about a fairness opinion not being a real valuation. Then he goes on to give, I think, what is the game away. He says, look, Lazard and Evercore, are just bankers. Their expertise is in pitching and sourcing and negotiating and executing deals and in plugging in discount rates into preset spreadsheets, not knowing the future. That's pretty damning indictment of bankers, because if it's true, my question is, what the heck are they doing giving fairness opinions and charging millions of dollars for something that they're not qualified to do? So I think that it might make sense to look past the bankers in this deal at the very notion of a fairness opinion. Now, I'm not a lawyer and I don't intend to play one on this webcast, but a person who is a lawyer, an excellent lawyer, a person who writes very well, Stephen Davidoff, in an article on fairness opinions, which I'd strongly recommend, defines a fairness opinion as an opinion provided by an outsider, presumably a qualified outsider, that a transaction meets a threshold level of fairness from a financial perspective. I'm not sure what other perspective there is, but I guess a financial perspective, level of fairness outside. Hey, that sounds pretty good, right? And in fact, the way it's practiced, the fairness opinion is usually developed by a banker or an appraiser. It's delivered orally to the board of directors of the company at the time of the transaction. It's followed up with a 2 to 3 page letter, probably not much longer than that summarizes the transaction terms and the appraiser's assumptions and attests to the fact that the price paid is fair from a financial point of view. So most deals now come with a fairness opinion. It's not required, but it's almost part of the process now. And one reason for that is a Delaware court judgment. Like everything else in business, much of what happens in the Delaware courts becomes entrenched as practice. It's a judgment delivered in 1985 in a case involving a leveraged buyout of a company called TransUnion. And in that case, the Delaware court found the board lacking. It found the board was involved in self-dealing, and it essentially struck down what the board did. But it then gave a safe harbor. Basically, it said, if you'd done this, if you'd actually gone out and elicited a fairness opinion from anyone in a position to know the firm's value, we would have let this pass. Amazing, right? The court does these things with the best of intentions and it becomes standard practice. So once that judgment came out, bankers and deal makers recognized that by having a fairness opinion, they could get a shield in the Delaware courts. Now, having said that, let's look at how it's actually practiced. Is it actually fair? Does it actually protect the investors in the deal? After all, the Delaware courts said they wanted a fairness opinion because they wanted investors in the deal to be protected. Here's what I see as practice, and if you think I'm being a little harsh, take a look at some of the fairness opinions that are out there. The managers supply the earnings, the revenues, and in some cases the cash flows, as they did in the Tesla SolarCity deal. The appraiser or the bank doing the fairness opinion concocts a discount rate. Now, I know, again, it sounds harsh, but they come up with a rate and then they reverse engineer to that number by using standard models. So if you look at the actual worksheet, it looks like they started with risk-free rates and betas and risk premiums and debt ratios, but the reality is they started with a discount rate of 10 to 12 or 12 to 15 or 9.5 to 10.5 and backed into that number. At the end of the forecast period, because managers don't forecast earnings and cash flows forever, the appraiser slaps on either a multiple, which is usually not reflective of what the company looks like 5 or 10 years down the road, or a growth rate forever that is not sustainable and comes up with a terminal value. They discount those cash flows back at that concocted discount rate, they come up with a value. If the value is too low, they proceed to add premiums, like what? A 20% control premium, a 30% synergy premium. If it's too high relative to what they'd like to see, they start discounting things. In fact, I tell people, look at what people do after they tell you they're done in terms of premiuming and discounting, and you'll get a window into the bias in the process. And then here comes, I think, the part that actually makes this almost completely useless. They're allowed to give a range of prices. You're saying, what's wrong with it? There's uncertainty about the future. A range basically says, this is a possible price from 3 to 350. In my experience, when you put ranges on value, they become completely useless from a decision or an action standpoint. And for doing this immense service, they charge millions of dollars, and worse still, they make a big chunk of the millions contingent on the deal getting done. So let me ask you some questions. How is this fair? Where's the fairness in this process? Why is it an opinion? After all, the numbers come from managers. Where is the protection from bad deals if you give me a range so big that I have no idea whether the price is fair or not? And why are we paying millions for this abysmal service? So here's the question I have. Is protection worth it? Well, I think it's not worth it if it's false protection. Because right now what's happening is a fairness opinion is a checkbox. Well, you check it off and you say, well, I did my fairness opinion. That's due diligence. It's what board of directors are starting to use to immunize themselves against legal consequences. Second, by providing the illusion of fairness, it actually makes stockholders more sanguine, less likely to ask questions. And worst of all, the practices that you see in the valuations that back up fairness opinions are so abysmal that this is a process where the bad appraisers are going to drive out the good ones. And here's why. If I'm a manager or a board that wants to make a bad deal, don't ask me why. I might want to build an empire. They might be self-dealing. You know what? I'm going to shop around until I find somebody who gives me a fairness opinion. Over time, the least scrupulous appraisers are going to drive out the fairest and the most principled ones. And as somebody involved in valuation, I'm afraid that these bad practices, the sewer that we call fairness opinion valuation, is starting to spill over into other valuation practices. So this is purely self-interest on my part. I want to stop this spilling over. So I think we need to do something about this. And as I see it, there are two choices we have. One is to get rid of the fairness opinion. If it's neither fair nor opinion, why the heck have it? And think of the millions of dollars we would save if we just got rid of it. I know that's going to be tough to do because once something becomes entrenched in practice, you can't let it go. So the second option is to fix it. And to fix it, we need two things. One is we need courts that are willing to ask tough questions. You're saying that's going to require courts to wander into areas they're not designed to go into. I'll give you some very simple questions that I think we can ask to make sure fairness opinions are fair in opinions. And second, we need punishment for bad behavior. Bad behavior on the part of appraisers, bad behavior on the part of boards of directors, bad behavior on the part of management. So here, as part of my contribution to the process, my pro bono contribution, because I don't do expert witness work, but I'm giving this as my contribution to Delaware court judges. Here are 7 questions I think you might want to ask the next banker, the next appraiser who comes up in front of you with a fairness opinion. The first is, who's paying you to do this valuation? How much are you getting paid? And is any of the payment contingent on the deal happening? Incidentally, this is now public information, or should be, because it was required under FINRA 2290. You are now required to reveal this. Might as well ask them directly, because here's what I'm looking for. And I've classified the responses into red flag responses and green flag responses. Red flag responses are responses which should lead you to question the fairness of this opinion, and green flag is good. So here's a red flag opinion. If you're being paid disproportionately large amounts of money for an appraisal, like what? I mean, give them an hourly rate. I'm willing to concede a $10,000 per hour rate. Think about how many hours it required an Evercore or a Lazard to come up with the numbers, and then ask yourself, is it worth $7 million? So if it's disproportionately large, you should be suspicious. And if any of the payment is contingent on the deal happening, in my view, I think you should throw the fairness opinion out. It cannot be fair if you have brought that much bias in the process. A green response is, we're getting paid a reasonable amount, and as I've said, I'm willing to accept a really high hourly rate. and your payment is not contingent on the deal. Second, where are the cash flows that you're using in the valuation? The red response was, what cash flows? They just came from managers, which is what the response you got in the Tesla Solar City deal was. And the green response was, we came up with the revenues, earnings, and cash flows with management inputs. I accept the fact that management knows stuff, has plans that you'd like to find out, but it's still your job to estimate those numbers based on the inputs. Third question to ask, are your cash flows internally consistent? That sounds fancy. But when I look at an intrinsic valuation, there are three, I think about what I call my valuation iron triangle. But there are three sides to the triangle. There's growth, there's risk, and reinvestment. Here's what I'd expect to see. If I see a company where there's high growth in the cash flows, I'd expect to see high reinvestment and high risk. Are there exceptions? Sure. And if there are exceptions, I need you to tell me why. Exceptions in what sense? If you have a company with high growth and low reinvestment, you might have an explanation. You might say, look, we've already invested in 300% capacity. That's why we have low reinvestment. So you're looking for consistency. Consistency in currency. As we go to more global valuations, you want to make sure your currency, your cash flows, and your discount rate are in the same currency, which effectively locks in the same inflation assumptions into both. You have to make sure that your cash flows are to the same claim holders. If your cash flows are to equity investors, so-called levered cash flows, your discount rate should be a cost of equity. If it's the entire business, it should be a cost of capital. And finally, is it consistent in terms of the growth, reinvestment, and risk assumption? If you, and the red flags you're looking for is the banker says, what consistency? We do this on every one of our valuations. We're consistent. If there has been no test for consistency on the cash flows, or the cash flows are not consistent, there's no good explanation, that's a red flag. If the cash flows are consistent or there's a good explanation for inconsistencies, that's good. That's a green flag. Then ask them what discount rate are you using in your valuation. And they're going to give you a number, and I guarantee you they're going to give you details, specifics. Because what they want you to do is get into the mud with them and discuss betas and risk premiums and risk-free rates. Don't go there. In fact, the only question you have to ask is the discount rate that you're using the norm? So if we have a steel company, for instance, I would expect your cost of capital to be 8% to 9%. Why? Because that's what the median cost of capital for a steel company is. If you're using a 15% cost of capital, you got to tell me why. So in fact, one thing I would suggest is that you have ranges of cost of capital, discount rates by sector. In fact, on my website, I do report median values and ranges for this. And if the number looks like it's in the norm, let it go. Don't go into the mud. Don't debate risk premiums and risk-free rates and betas. It's not worth the effort. It'll distract you. Fifth, ask them how they're applying closure to the valuation. In effect, how are you getting that terminal value? If the answer is we're applying an EBITDA multiple to the year 5 numbers, and the EBITDA multiple is a number that looks like it's a made-up number, push them on it, because that's really a pricing. If it's a growth rate in perpetuity, don't let them get away with stuff. If you see a growth rate of 5, 6, or 7%, don't let them give you the argument, this is a high growth company. It doesn't matter. This is a growth rate forever. It cannot be greater than the growth rate of the economy. Then ask them, what garnishing have you done? In effect, you're asking, what are the premiums and controls? Show me. And if they pull out a list of 4 premiums, you already know that the bias in this process is entrenched. Or 4 discounts. Again, the bias is entrenched. I'd prefer to see no garnishing at all. Or if there's garnishing, very limited garnishing. And finally, ask them what their final judgment is. If they give you a range of value that is so huge that any price could fit into it, ask them what's fair about this. Where's the opinion? I mean, I could have asked this of any person. They could have given me this number. What I would suggest is a distribution. That sounds fancy, but let me back this up. In fact, I have 4 very simple proposals to make fairness opinions fairer right off the bat. First, I don't think deal makers should ever be deal analysts. I know this should not even be stated because it's so obvious, but a deal maker wants a deal to get through. Asking him whether a deal is fair doesn't make sense. In fact, I would go further. I don't think deal makers should be allowed to make fairness opinion judgments on other people's deals, partly because there is too much of a quid pro quo, a danger of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours in this process. So I'd prefer that fairness opinions be restricted to those outfits, those appraisers who have no role in deal making. Second, there should be no deal contingent. I can't think of a good reason to make your fee for a fairness opinion contingent on the deal? I mean, what's the incentive here? Why do it? So there should be absolutely no deal contingent fees, and if there's a fairness opinion with a deal contingent fee, it should be tossed. Third, bankers should be forced to talk about whether they're pricing a company or valuing a company. I think the fairness opinion is about pricing. To be quite honest, I don't think discounted cash flow valuation should be used the way they are. In fact, I prefer honest pricing. Show me your multiples, show me your comparables. Also show me transparency as to how you got to this multiple and how you pick these comparables. Because I know from playing this game that if you let me pick the multiple and you let me pick the comparables, you've conceded the game to me. And finally, let me back up what I mean by distributions, not ranges. A few months ago on my website, I valued Apple, like I have for every 3 months for the last 6 years. And I could have given you, and if you look at my valuation, I accept the fact that I'm making assumptions. The assumptions could be wrong, and I could give you a range on the value. It's from $81 to $415. Think about it. If I gave you that range and you said, is a price of $160 possible? The answer is, of course it's possible. It's within the range. What I did instead in that valuation was to provide a distribution. The difference between a distribution and a range is while the lowest value in the distribution is 81 and the highest value is 415. If you gave me a price of 160, I can't get away by saying, hey, you know what? It's possible, because you can push me on it. A $160 price for Apple based on my distribution puts you at the 92nd percentile. That's possible, but it's definitely not plausible. And it's definitely not probable. I think fairness opinions should not be about possibilities. They should be about plausibilities. When somebody says a price is fair, it's not enough for them to say, hey, the price is possible. What kind of answer is that? I want to know the price is plausible and perhaps even probable. You're saying that sounds like a lot of work. Hey, if I'm paying you $7 million to do a valuation, if all you can supply is a range, I'm not getting much for my money. I'd much rather that you did this right and did a distribution. If you cannot do it, move on. There are other people who can. So the bottom line is, I think we need to fix this process, and I think we have to have consequences. Consequences for one, bad behavior. Well, if you have a fairness opinion which is a bad one, where on craftsmanship, you've just made assumptions that are unjustifiable, your craftsmanship is bad, I think there should be punishment. First, for the appraisers, I would toss out the fairness opinion, force the bankers or the appraisers involved to return the fees, and if I had my druthers, I'd create a hall of shame for those appraisers who are repeat offenders. A hall of shame where their names go up with examples of their most egregious offenses. We as investors need to know when a bank is called in for an appraisal what their history in this process is. And second, I think we need punishment for the boards of directors and managers, because the bankers are right. The managers and the board of directors are the precipitating factor for these bad fairness opinions. They want the deal to go through so badly that they're willing to bend the rules. I think that right now allowing boards of directors and managers to be shielded from this process just because of a fairness opinion is wrong. And if there is an unfair fairness opinion, I think they should be held responsible. And they should be sanctioned, and they should be required to make payments, and those payments have to come out of their own pockets. I know this sounds like it will chill the deal-making process, but if it does, so what? Too many bad deals go through. I'd much rather see fewer deals and more deals. So that's my view of fairness opinions. I know it might be extreme, but take it for what it's worth. Thank you very much for listening.